Joining us today is Thomas Sowell, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is the author of many books that have cast a critical eye at American society, including Inside American Education and Race and Culture. His latest book, The Vision of the Anointed, Self-Congratulation as the Basis for Social Policy, has been called a broadside against the received wisdom of America's elite liberal intelligentsia. Tom Sowell, why don't you start out and tell us what the Vision of the Anointed is about? What is it?
Well, it's a vision that the problems that we see in the world are due to the fact that other people are just not as bright or as compassionate as they are. And that there are all these solutions out there waiting to be discovered, and that they have them. And that these solutions are to be imposed upon the rest of us by the power of government through taxation or in other ways. And what's really crucial about it is that their passion is so much greater than the passion on the other side, largely because what they have involved is more.
Who is the they?
Oh, the media elite, the academic elite, political elites. And the reason we can talk about their vision, even though they obviously vary in their opinions, is that the basic set of underlying assumptions about the world are very similar. And because these assumptions are the prevailing assumptions, the need to find evidence for them or to offer proof is much less. If something happens, they'll explain it in a way which will fit that vision. For example, when they find that prenatal care is less among blacks than among whites, and that infant mortality rates are higher, they immediately assume this is because of society's neglect, and therefore if only the government will step in and provide more prenatal care, that problem solves itself. But in reality, other groups have even less prenatal care than blacks and don't have any more infant mortality than whites. But they don't ever get to that second stage, because once they've seen something that fits their conception of how the world works, that's sort of the end of it.
Let me go back to that idea of who the they is. I mean, in your cosmology, are these liberals? Is that what they are?
Yes. You have the New York Times, the Washington Post, Harvard, Stanford, the Edward Kennedys, all the usual suspects.
Let me.
But it's more than those particular people, because this mindset goes back at least 200 years.
Who does it start with? What is?
I don't know where it starts, but you can find it in the 18th century. If you read William Godwin, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice in 1793, you have the whole vision laid out just as it was in the 1960s. But the 1960s were a crucial point, because that's when this vision became dominant.
This sort of arrogant vision that we know best.
Oh, yes.
And don't even have to subject it to normal forms of proof.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think that when people say things like, more American wives are battered on Super Bowl Sunday, you see, than any other time of the year, and there's not a speck of evidence for that, that is calculated. Because there is no data that can even be misinterpreted that way. In other words, because there is no data, period. And so, yes, but I think that 99% of the people who believe it are not calculating. And I think one of the reasons that it flies without even being challenged for evidence is that there is a certain vision of how the world is, and in that world, men are oppressing women, and therefore, when you say something like this, it fits the vision, and that's the end of it. There's no demand for evidence.
You have in your book sort of a series toward the beginning of how the actual process works of forming one of these ideas and selling it and rejecting the proof. Maybe you could just kind of march it through this as a model of it.
All right, there's a four-stage pattern. And in the first stage is what I call the crisis. And so we're hyped to believe that something is a terrible crisis for which something must be done. What was fascinating to me in doing the research for the book is that very often the thing that's said to be in crisis has often been getting better for years on end. But that gets ignored. Then the second stage is,
for example, infant mortality, to use one of the
I'm thinking about teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. Those things were getting better. Teenage pregnancy was going down for more than a decade before sex education was introduced. Venereal disease, syphilis in 1960s had only half the incidence that it had in 1950. So all these things are going down, yet we're said to need sex education to deal with this crisis. which is then manufactured. And again, this is where the calculated part comes in. Now, 99% of the people who hear this don't know that. But the reason they accept it is because they also share the same vision. And because this is consonant with that vision, they don't have to ask for evidence.
All right, so what's stage two?
Stage two is
the first one is there's a crisis.
Yes.
They establish a crisis, usually an artificial one.
Yes.
Okay.
Then stage two is the solution. You have a solution for this crisis. In this case, you have sex education in the schools. And then at that point, you say, if we do this, this will lead to beneficial result A. The critics say, no, it'll lead to detrimental result Z. Stage three, you put it in the results, you put it in, and directly you find detrimental result Z, namely venereal disease and teenage pregnancy take off into the stratosphere. And then stage four is the fascinating part, in which they simply say, no, that doesn't prove that this was a bad policy, because there are many factors. There's complexity. It's simplistic to blame it on this. But they run through this routine on so many different things, including crime. Similarly, they said, in 1960, Judge Bazelon said we just desperately need to have some kind of change in the criminal justice system. Now, in 1960, there were fewer murders than there had been in 1950, 1940, or 1930. But again, that was completely ignored. And so now we have the revolution in the criminal justice system. People say, no, if you have put these new things in, there'll be more crime than before. They put them in. Almost instantly, the declining crime rate turns around and heads up again. And they say, no, it's simplistic to blame this on this. There are the root causes and the neglect of society and all the rest of it. So it's heads I win, tails you lose.
Why would a group of liberal intellectuals or politicians or media stars or whatever, why would they sit around and decide to dismember or dilute the criminal justice system if they thought in advance that it would raise the amount of criminality?
Oh, they didn't think that, but the point is,
they just thought wrongly that it would help.
Yes, but it would also give them an enormously larger role than they had before. I mean, a judge who just sits there and applies the laws that have been passed by the legislature has a very minor role. But if he takes the expansive judicial activist role, then of course he's on the leading edge, and he can look for the hosannas and all the rest of it from the sideline.
How does this play out in the realm of something else you have written about, which is affirmative action?
Exactly the same
How does
thing.
that process? What's the 1, 2, 3, 4 on that?
I haven't worked it out like that, but certainly there is no interest whatever in finding out empirically whether things have been made better or worse for minorities as a result of this program. And in fact, if you bring them up evidence, they'll say, but things would have been even worse had we not done this. Similarly with the war on poverty, you can show how dependency on government was going down, poverty was going down before this program was ever put in. And within a few years, dependence on government was going up, and after a few more years, the absolute number of people in poverty was going up. This was sold to the country, not on the grounds that if you transferred money from A to B, that B would have more money. That was not the argument. The argument was that dependency would be reduced, that you would, quote, invest in people, as Bill Clinton is now saying, now that people have forgotten what was said in the 60s. This will then, you give them job training and all those kinds of things, parenting skills, the whole bit. And this will then be an investment that will pay off in the future because there'll be fewer people dependent upon the government than there were before. And I go through a great number of people, from John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson, the New York Times, again, all the usual suspects, said all these things.
Lyndon Johnson was not a usual suspect, Tom.
Well, he was the primary suspect. All right. But the fact is, that was never tested. And when there were all these wonderful retrospectives held down in Texas and other places about this, the first order of business is to evade the criterion that they themselves set up when they set this out. And so no matter what happens, if it's a failure by the original criterion, then we just find another criterion by which it will be a success.
Well, let's just examine that for a minute. I have a friend of mine from those old White House days was listening to, again, Gingrich shortly after we had this great Republican Revolution in 1994. A great meaning huge, not necessarily wonderful. We shall see about that. And he kept hearing Newt Gingrich use the word opportunity. This conservative opportunity society, we have to provide opportunity. And I was talking to him, he said, Gingrich uses that word opportunity almost as much as Johnson did, which is what you're saying, that was the rhetoric. It was called the OEO, was the Office of Economic Opportunity.
Yes.
That's what it was. Now, So if liberals were talking about opportunity, and now conservatives are talking about opportunity, and I'm sure you're for opportunity.
All God's children got opportunity.
All God's children got opportunity. So what is your problem that liberals said we ought to create programs for opportunity? And in point of fact, I mean, I won't say play devil's advocate, because I mean a lot of the things that came out of the Great Society, I mean, building all those junior colleges and community colleges.
Oh, I would disagree entirely. I think that was a tragedy of the first magnitude.
That was a tragedy.
Yes.
Why is that a tragedy?
You have millions of people who have absolutely no desire for an education, using up billions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, and not only not getting an education themselves, making it more difficult to give an education to those people who came to college with an idea of getting one.
Now, you say they have no desire for an education. I mean, nobody is herding them into these community colleges and into the junior colleges and into the state university. I mean, they have a desire, obviously.
No, they do not, obviously, because lots of things go on in those places that are not education. I mean, where else can you find so many young people of the same age and opposite sex in one place? A nice, convenient place to be. But anyone who is taught in a lot of these places, this ferocious desire for education as such is not terribly visible. And I taught at places where we've gotten, the upper 10, 15% of students. I mean, UCLA and whatnot. Neither I nor my colleagues found this great desire for education as such. They wanted to be in ivy-covered buildings for 4 years in order to get more money when they graduate and have a good time while they're there.
So you think the great American ideal, which has really been shared by both parties and both ideologies over recent decades, to allow more people to get into higher education, that is a bankrupt idea?
Oh, to allow is one thing, but to subsidize people at enormous cost, with no real sign that this is producing what we intend to produce.
When you say subsidize, I mean, you talk about a junior college, a community college. I guess that's subsidized. It's below cost tuition, but it does allow kids who do not have the money to go to Amherst or wherever to start a college education. I mean,
people did that before the Great Society. I did it before the Great Society. My whole generation did it before the Great Society.
You are saying that the great humanitarian political impulses of the 1960s have been almost without exception bad.
Well, there have been some good ones, but I'm saying that the assumption that on the education front, I mean, I would defy you to find a large number of people who've actually taught these students who really think that they're out there thirsting for knowledge.
Well, if you suppose they are thirsting for a better job, and we've set up a society where you have to be credentialed with a certain amount of college, so aren't they able to get a better job?
No,
because
this is the fallacy of composition. If one person stands up in the stadium, he sees the game better, but if they all stand up, they don't all see the game better. As long as, if you have a degree and the other guy doesn't, then you get ahead of him in the employment line. But we're not going to all get ahead of each other in the employment line by all getting degrees.
So this whole idea that, I guess, again, both liberals and conservatives are saying is that at this particular moment, 1995, we have to get more people into the education system because that's the way to compete, and we look at the data and we see that the people with more education are earning more money than ever before relative to the people with less education. That's all a fallacy of everybody standing up in the stadium.
People who fly on the Concorde, kids who've flown on the Concorde undoubtedly will make more money than kids who've only gone on buses. That does not mean if we put a lot of people on the Concorde, we're going to raise the national income.